The sun was sinking low behind the jagged teeth of the New Mexico mesas, bleeding red light across the horizon. Wind hissed through the canyon like a dying breath, kicking up long whirls of dust that danced across the hardpan. It was the kind of evening that belonged to ghosts, when the land turned bronze and silent, and even the coyotes went quiet. A lone rider moved slow along the trail, a big man on a bigger horse, both worn by travel. His coat was the color of sand, his hat wide-brimmed and tilted low to shield his eyes from the dying sun. His name was Caleb Boone. Some said he'd fought for the North. Others swore he'd worn gray when it suited him. None could say for sure which side he called his own, and Caleb never bothered correcting anyone. The truth, like most of his past, was buried somewhere out in the desert with the bones of men he'd rather forget. His hands were scarred, thick, callous things that looked built for breaking more than building, and his eyes were a hard gray, like thunderheads that never cleared. He rode in silence, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather the only sound that followed him. Dust clung to his coat, to his beard, to the memory of everywhere he'd been. He was a man who didn't belong anywhere, and he knew it. As twilight thickened, he saw the faint outline of a way station up ahead, a lonely structure of pine logs and a slanted porch leaning against the wind. A lantern flickered weakly near the door. The smell of horses and dry hay hung in the air. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop, letting the reins hang loose. For a moment, he simply listened. Then came the sound, distant but sharp, the crack of a rifle echoing down the canyon. Another shot followed, then a woman's scream. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He dismounted fast, boots sinking into the dust, and drew the long-barreled revolver from his belt. The metal gleamed dull in the fading light. The way station lay maybe 200 yards ahead, and beyond it, a stagecoach sat tilted on a broken axle, half hidden by the slope of the road. Horses reared and screamed, their reins tangled. Dark figures moved in the smoke and grit. Outlaws, 5, maybe 6 of them, swarming like wolves. Caleb crouched behind a rock outcrop, eyes scanning the scene. The lead bandit barked orders, tall, thin, with a coat of black leather and a face like a hawk. Caleb knew that kind of man, mean, patient, and clever. That was Silas Crane, a name he'd heard before, a name that left graves behind it. Crane's men fired into the air, spooking the stage horses until they tore free and vanished down the trail. The driver, an old man with white whiskers, was dragged from the seat. He didn't beg, didn't even curse, just looked at them once before Crane's revolver barked, and the old man fell face first in the dust. The passengers were next. There was only one, a young woman in a traveling dress, face pale beneath her bonnet. She tried to run, but one of Crane's men caught her by the arm and spun her hard. She fought like a wildcat, landing a slap that left a red mark across his cheek. He laughed, ugly and low. Caleb's jaw tightened. He could have fired then, maybe taken 2 down before the rest turned their guns. But there were too many, and the light was dying fast. So he watched, every nerve burning, waiting for the right moment. Crane stepped closer to the woman, tipping his hat with mock civility. "Evelyn Hart, ain't it?" he drawled. "Rancher's daughter. Heading out to your uncle's spread near Dry Creek, right? Man like me keeps track of pretty things passing through." She spat at him. He only grinned wider. "Load her up," he ordered. "We got use for ransom, or worse." They bound her hands, dragged her toward their horses, and within minutes, they were gone, a swirl of dust and hoofbeats fading into the distance. Caleb waited until the last echo of hooves died before he moved. He walked to the coach, his boots crunching glass and gravel. The driver lay still beside the wheel, his hat blown off, eyes open to the stars, just starting to appear. Caleb crouched down and closed them with his fingers. The young woman's bag was torn open beside the wreck, a letter half buried in the dirt. Caleb picked it up. It was addressed to Mr. Samuel Hart, Dry Creek Ranch. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear enough. "Father sends me away for my safety, says the outlaws have returned." Caleb read the line twice, then folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat. His horse pawed the dirt nearby, restless, as if knowing what was coming. He glanced once at the sky. The first stars were out, sharp and cold. Then his gaze dropped to the ground, where hoofprints marked the way north. He followed them a few paces, knelt down, and touched the soil. Still warm. They were less than an hour ahead. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing in the night air, heavy with dust and blood. Something inside him stirred, something old, something he'd buried deep when the war ended. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished locket. The hinge was cracked from years of wear, but inside was a faded portrait of a woman, soft eyes, dark hair, and a smile that still hurt to look at. Her name had been Clara, his wife. She died in a raid years ago, taken by men who laughed just like Crane's gang had laughed tonight. Caleb closed the locket, the click loud in the stillness. His hand lingered on it a moment before he tucked it back beneath his shirt. He looked at the trail again, at the faint glint of moonlight on the rocks. Then he went to his horse, tightened the cinch, and swung into the saddle. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder down the canyon. Caleb adjusted his hat brim low, jaw set. He didn't pray, didn't curse, didn't speak. He just looked once more toward the dark horizon, where the outlaws had vanished. The horse moved beneath him, heavy and sure, hoofs beating slow and steady as they climbed the ridge. Behind him, the way station flickered dimly, one lonely lantern swaying in the wind. Ahead, the desert stretched out endless and cruel, a world of dust and vengeance, waiting to be walked through. Caleb Boone rode into it without hesitation, a giant shadow against the dying light, one man chasing six, and the silence that followed him was the silence of something awakening. By the time night fully claimed the land, the sound of his horse had faded into the wind. Only the stars remained, cold and watchful, as if they knew what was coming for the men who had taken the rancher's daughter. And somewhere far off, Silas Crane's gang rode laughing through the dark, not knowing that the storm that hunted them had already begun to ride. The desert changed faces with every hour of daylight, and Caleb Boone read each one like scripture. The morning after the ambush, the land stretched out before him, endless ridges, baked gullies, and the faint shimmer of heat already rising from the ground. He dismounted, crouched low, and studied the earth. The signs were faint, but they spoke clear to a man who'd learned to listen. Fresh hoofprints cut through the sand, overlapping, one rider dragging a lighter horse, the captive's mount maybe. A broken mesquite branch still oozed sap. They'd passed this way at dawn. Caleb touched the ground with 2 fingers. Still warm. He rose without a word and swung back into the saddle. His horse, a broad-shouldered gray named Sable, snorted once and started forward. They moved in silence except for the creak of leather and the distant cry of a hawk tracing lazy circles high above. By noon, the trail led through a canyon carved deep into red rock, where shadows pooled like spilled ink. Caleb slowed his horse, scanning every bend. The gang had left careless signs, ashes from a small fire, a whiskey bottle lying on its side, a clump of horsehair snagged on a thorn. They were getting comfortable. That was good. Men who felt safe made mistakes. Half a mile farther, he saw something in the sand, a boot, the heel torn clean off. A few yards beyond, a man lay half buried in dust, his clothes shredded and blood crusted around his mouth. Caleb knelt beside him, tipping back the man's hat. He was young, barely 20, skin blistered by the sun. His breath rattled like a dry gourd. Water, the boy croaked. Caleb pulled his canteen and tilted it to his lips. The boy drank greedily, coughing half of it back up. They left me, he wheezed. Crane's men. Took the girl. Caleb's voice came low, gravel-edged. How many? 6. Maybe 7. Crane, Red Jack, and that one they call Briggs. Big fellow with a scar. He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the horizon as if the gang might rise from it. They don't keep captives long, mister. The words broke off into a wet cough. Caleb waited, but the boy's chest stopped moving. He lay still, head turned toward the sun. Caleb closed his eyes for him and stood. No prayers, no words. The desert didn't care for ceremony. He climbed back into the saddle and rode on. As the hours dragged, the air grew hotter, shimmering above the sand like molten glass. Caleb's coat clung to him, heavy with sweat and dust. He tore off a strip of jerky and chewed slow, eyes scanning the ridges for movement. Every few miles, He found another trace. A spent cartridge, a scrap of cloth, horse dung still fresh. The gang wasn't pushing hard. They thought no one was following. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather over the western hills, bruised and dark. Thunder rolled like a far-off drum. Caleb remembered the sound from years ago. The cannon fire at Antietam, the way it shook the earth beneath his boots. He'd been a sharpshooter then, stationed in a tree line, killing men whose faces he never saw. The war had taught him the weight of pulling a trigger and the silence that followed it. When he came home, he'd found his cabin burned, his wife and child gone. Raiders had done it, men no different from Crane's kind. That night, he stopped talking. Some wounds didn't heal, they just went quiet. The first drops of rain hit hard and fast. Caleb pulled his duster close as the storm swept down the valley, lightning tearing across the sky. The horse reared once, frightened by the thunder, but Caleb steadied him with a calm hand and pressed on. Water rushed down the canyon walls, turning the trail into a shallow stream. Still he rode. By dusk, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sharp scent of wet sage and smoke. Caleb caught that smoke again a few miles farther, a faint column rising from behind a ridge. He dismounted, leading Sable the last 100 yards on foot. The remains of a campfire smoldered beneath a cliff. A burned wagon sat nearby, its wheels twisted, its frame charred black. Buzzards circled overhead. Caleb's gut turned cold. He walked closer, the soles of his boots crunching over glass and ash. Inside the wreckage lay 2 men, one shot in the head, the other burned where he fell. Not Crane's men. Travelers, maybe caught in the wrong place. He knelt, sifting through the debris until something soft brushed his hand. A bonnet torn, singed at the edge, pale blue once, now darkened by soot. Evelyn Hart's. He held it for a long moment, fingers tightening. The faint smell of lavender clung to the fabric. Then he folded it gently and tucked it into his coat beside the locket. The wind shifted, carrying the distant whinny of horses. Caleb froze, head tilted. He could hear them, 3, maybe 4 animals, somewhere beyond the rocks. He moved silently, weaving between shadows until the flicker of a campfire came into view. Crane's men were camped below a sandstone ridge, laughing loud, their rifles stacked against a log. One of them, a wiry scout with a beard like brushwood, stood apart, taking first watch. Caleb's hand rested on the butt of his Colt. His heartbeat slowed. He waited until the scout wandered from the fire to relieve himself behind a boulder. Caleb moved and then, quiet as falling dust. The man turned just in time to see a shape rise behind him. Caleb's arm shot out, one hand clamping over the outlaw's mouth, the other driving a knife clean between his ribs. The man jerked once, then sagged against him, lifeless. Caleb lowered the body to the ground and knelt beside it. The outlaw's eyes were still open, reflecting the campfire's glow. Caleb whispered, more to himself than to the dead, "That's one." He wiped the blade clean on the man's coat and studied the camp. Crane's voice carried through the still air, low, confident, the kind of tone that commanded without effort. "We rest here tonight," he was saying. "Tomorrow we take her through Diablo Pass. Nobody'll follow us there." Evelyn's voice came faintly then, angry and trembling. "You'll hang for this, all of you." Crane laughed. "Maybe, but not before we get paid." Caleb eased back into the dark, memorizing their numbers, their positions, the sound of each man's voice. Then he slipped away, silent as the night wind. He had his trail, and now he had their plan. The moon rose silver over the desert, painting everything in pale light. Caleb rode out along a dry creek bed, his horse's hooves muffled in the soft sand. He didn't sleep. Sleep was for men who didn't have ghosts pressing against their ribs. He thought of Clara again, of the cabin door swinging open to the smell of smoke, of her hands reaching for him before the fire took everything. The memory burned behind his eyes, sharper than the desert wind. He'd told himself for years that revenge was for fools, that killing the men responsible wouldn't bring her back. But now, with Evelyn Hart's life hanging in the balance, that old fury stirred again. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant and cold. Somewhere beyond the ridges, Crane's gang lay sleeping, their laughter fading into snores. Caleb rode until dawn painted the world in dull orange. When the sun broke over the horizon, he was already miles ahead of them, circling toward Diablo Pass. He reined in at a rise overlooking the narrow gorge. The place was as mean as its name, a slit of rock barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, the ground littered with bones bleached white by years of sun. Devil's Hollow was the kind of place even the wind avoided, a jagged scar of red stone and shadow buried deep in the desert. It lay silent except for the whisper of dying campfire smoke curling into the night. The canyon walls rose steep and crooked, like the ribs of something ancient long dead. It was there Silas Crane's gang made camp, 6 men, a stolen woman, and a sense of safety that only fools and doomed men could feel. From the high ridge above, Caleb Boone watched them. He lay belly down in the dirt, rifle across his arm, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. Below, the outlaws drank and laughed around the fire, their voices echoing off the cliffs. Evelyn Hart sat bound near the wagon, her face streaked with dust, but her eyes still bright with defiance. Caleb studied her for a long moment, noting the way she turned her head toward the sound of laughter, more anger than fear in that gaze. It stirred something in him he thought the years had burned out. He began his work just before midnight. The first man died without a sound. He had wandered off from camp to relieve himself, too drunk to notice the soft crunch of boots behind him. Caleb's knife found the gap between ribs, sliding clean and sure. He caught the man before he hit the ground, lowered him gently, and waited. The canyon swallowed every sound. He dragged the body behind a rock, eyes never leaving the flicker of the campfire below. He moved like mist after that, patient, precise. A rifle barrel glinted near the wagon, and Caleb's revolver whispered once. The outlaw fell backward, arms flailing, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. Another stirred from sleep and stumbled toward the fire, calling out for his friend. The call died in his throat as Caleb's shadow rose behind him. A hand clamped over his mouth, a blade opened his neck, and the dust drank deep. By dawn, 3 were gone, and the others had begun to feel it. The change in the air, the way the silence thickened. Crane paced near the fire, revolver drawn, scanning the cliffs. "Something's out there," he muttered. "We ain't alone." Red Jack, his second, spat into the fire. "Coyotes, maybe." "You're jumpy, boss." Crane glared at him. "Coyotes don't kill a man and take his boots." Evelyn sat still, her wrists raw from the ropes, listening to the unease growing among them. She had caught glimpses through the smoke, shadows moving where no wind stirred, the faintest flash of metal in the moonlight. Once she'd seen him, tall, silent, eyes like storm clouds, watching from the rocks. She didn't know his name, but hope took root where terror had been. By the second night, paranoia owned the camp. The men turned on each other, accusing, shouting, guns half drawn. Crane tried to keep them in line, but the fear in their eyes was something older than him, something the desert itself whispered. One man, Briggs, tried to ride out under the moon. They found his horse the next morning, reins cut, the saddle empty. His body hung from a mesquite branch at the canyon's mouth, a warning carved into the bark, 1 for 1. Evelyn prayed in silence when they saw it. Crane didn't. He just stared at the corpse, jaw tight, and muttered, "Boone." He said the name like a curse. That night, lightning crawled across the clouds above the cliffs, white veins against a bruise-colored sky. The air smelled of rain and gunpowder. Crane ordered the fire doused. The men huddled near the wagon, rifles ready, eyes darting at every rustle in the dark. Caleb waited on the ridge until the storm broke. Thunder rolled through the canyon, masking every sound but the wind. He took the high ground, moving from boulder to boulder, his long rifle cradled steady in his hands. Lightning lit the ground below, and in that strobe of white, he saw Crane's men crouched tight, every muscle coiled. He exhaled slowly, the way he had at Antietam, when the world turned smoke and screams, and his finger had learned the language of death. One shot cracked through the storm, clean and sharp. A man near the wagon dropped instantly, his hat spinning into the mud. Another fired wildly into the cliffs, shouting curses into the thunder. The muzzle flash made him a beacon, and Caleb's second bullet found him before his curse was done. Crane ducked behind the wagon, fury cutting through fear. "You think you're a ghost, Boone," he shouted into the storm. I know who you are. I've seen your work. A flicker of movement behind the rocks drew his eye. He fired twice, the shots deafened by thunder, but the figure was gone. Then a whisper of steps came behind him, close, too close. He spun just as a massive shadow broke from the dark. The revolver flew from his hand as Caleb's shoulder slammed into him, driving him into the mud. They grappled in the rain, two men bound by years of violence and memory. Crane swung hard, catching Caleb's jaw, but the drifter didn't flinch. He grabbed Crane's coat, twisted, and threw him down. Mud splattered their faces. Lightning flashed again, carving their shapes into stark silhouettes. One predator, one prey, though the difference between them had long since blurred. You should have stayed dead, Crane hissed, reaching for his knife. Caleb kicked it away, then landed a fist that cracked bone. The outlaw reeled, coughing blood, but still grinning through the pain. You think you're justice. You're just another killer who forgot who he was. Caleb's revolver lay inches from Crane's hand. They both saw it at once. Crane lunged, but Caleb was faster. The muzzle pressed against the outlaw's chest. For a moment, neither spoke, the rain drumming between them like 1,000 ticking clocks. Your boon, Crane whispered, disbelief flickering behind the pain. The ghost of Antietam. The shot cut through thunder. Crane's body jerked once, then went still. Evelyn watched from the shadows, her breath catching as the echoes faded. The rain softened, running in thin streams down the canyon walls. She saw the tall drifter rise slowly, his silhouette framed by lightning, the revolver smoking in his hand. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something else behind him, the faint outline of a soldier from another time, a ghost saluting him before fading into rain. Caleb turned toward her, mud streaked across his coat, his face unreadable. He walked to where she sat bound, knelt, and cut her free with a single stroke of his knife. She rubbed her wrists, staring up at him through tears and rain. Who are you? She whispered. He didn't answer. He just tipped his hat slightly, the gesture half acknowledgement, half farewell. When she stood, unsteady but proud, she noticed the locket hanging from his neck, the same one she had seen once in her father's cabin, holding the picture of her late Aunt Clara. Realization hit her like a wind through the chest, but before she could speak, he had already turned toward the canyon mouth. Behind them, the fire hissed out in the rain. Around them, the bodies of Crane's men lay scattered like shadows washed clean. The storm rolled west, leaving the air sharp and still. Evelyn called after him once, her voice soft. Mr. Boone. He paused, only for a moment, then mounted his horse. The sound of hooves echoed up the canyon, fading into the distance until all that remained was the whisper of wind through Devil's Hollow. The desert took back its silence, and somewhere beyond the cliffs, beneath a clearing sky, a legend rode into dawn, leaving behind nothing but justice carved in stone and the faint memory of a ghost who once walked among the living. The storm had passed, leaving the canyon hushed and raw, the air sharp with the scent of rain and gunpowder. Smoke drifted from dying fires, curling around the lifeless forms scattered among the rocks. The thunder that had once shaken Devil's Hollow now murmured faintly somewhere over the far mesas, retreating like a spirit satisfied with its work. Evelyn stood where he had left her, her hands still trembling even though the ropes were gone. Her tears mixed with the rain, tracing pale streaks through the dust on her cheeks. Around her, the night was giving way to a dull, bruised dawn, light seeping slowly over the canyon rim. She watched Caleb Boone move through the wreckage like a shadow made flesh, silent and heavy with purpose. He gathered the guns first, one by one, tossing each into the mud, where they could harm no one again. His coat hung soaked and dark, clinging to his broad shoulders. Every movement seemed slower now, deliberate, as if the weight of what he had done, and what it had cost, was settling into his bones. Evelyn took a step toward him, then stopped. The man who had killed 6 outlaws in 2 days now knelt beside the last of them, his hands trembling as he closed Silas Crane's eyes. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent, as though he understood something about the man even in hatred. When he rose, their eyes met across the pale light. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Then he turned and walked to his horse, untying his bedroll, pulling free a small shovel. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "Burying what's left," he said. His voice was low, roughened by dust and silence. "You don't owe them that." He didn't answer, just started digging. The sound of the shovel striking wet sand echoed in the stillness. Evelyn watched, her chest tightening. Each grave was shallow but carefully made. He laid the men in one by one, covering them with stones and loose earth. For mercy, perhaps not, but for order, for something like peace. When he finished, he stood for a while, head bowed, hat in hand. The sun was climbing now, streaking the sky with gold and rose, painting the edges of the cliffs like fire. It was the first warmth the land had known in days, but it did little to thaw the cold inside them both. Evelyn walked to him, her boots squelching softly in the mud. Up close, she could see the lines etched deep around his mouth, the weariness behind his gray eyes. He looked like a man who'd carried the world on his shoulders too long. "You saved my life," she said. He shook his head. "Didn't save it. Just took back what they stole." She hesitated, then reached out. "You don't have to go yet. My uncle, he'll want to thank you. We can give you food, rest." Caleb turned slightly, and that was when she saw it, the small, tarnished locket hanging from a leather cord at his neck. It had swung free when he bent to retrieve his hat, catching a glint of sunlight. The sight made her breath catch. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. He looked down, fingers brushing it unconsciously. "This belonged to someone I once knew." Evelyn's heart stilled. She stepped closer, voice trembling. "That locket, it's my aunt's. Clara Hart. She wore it every day of her life until the raid." Caleb's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he exhaled, slow and heavy. "I knew her before the war, before the fire took everything." His voice softened, almost breaking on the words. "She was my wife." Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. The canyon seemed to tilt around her, the silence swelling like a heartbeat. "Then you're Caleb Boone," he finished quietly, "though I buried that name a long time ago." Tears filled her eyes again, not from fear or shock, but from something deeper, recognition, grief, wonder. She had heard stories whispered since childhood about a soldier who disappeared after the war, a man called the Ghost of Antietam, who vanished into the frontier and was never seen again. No one had ever told her that man was her aunt's lost husband. Evelyn's voice trembled. "She never stopped waiting for you." Caleb's eyes dropped to the locket. He rubbed his thumb over its worn surface. "I tried to come home. By the time I did, there was nothing left but ashes. A man don't come back from that kind of thing." The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of wet sage and the faintest trace of smoke. Evelyn stepped closer and took his hand. His fingers were rough, cold, but they closed around hers with surprising gentleness. "Maybe you came back tonight," she said softly. "Not for her, but for me. For what's right." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years, his expression cracked. The hardness in his eyes gave way to something raw and human, sorrow, maybe even peace. "I reckon that's up to God," he murmured. For a while, they stood together in the morning light, saying nothing. The desert stretched endlessly before them, the sun rising higher, warming the stones where the dead lay buried. The world felt wider somehow, as if it, too, was exhaling after holding its breath. When he finally turned to leave, Evelyn followed him to the ridge. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Caleb cinched his saddle, patted Sable's neck, and looked toward the horizon where the land bled into gold. "No one ever really sees a ghost twice," he said with a faint smile. She wanted to speak, to ask him to stay, but something in his face stopped her. There was finality there, not coldness, but acceptance. He swung into the saddle, the movement slow, almost ceremonial. Evelyn watched as he guided the horse to the rise, pausing once to look back. Their eyes met one last time. She lifted her hand in silent farewell. He tipped his hat. Then he turned and rode on. The sound of his horse's hooves echoed through the canyon, fading until it blended with the whisper of the wind. The sun broke fully over the horizon, spilling gold across the red stone and sage. The graves caught the light, the rough stones gleaming like coins laid upon the eyes of the fallen. Evelyn stood long after he was gone, watching that lone figure grow smaller against the desert's vast heart. In that moment, she understood what the old-timers meant when they spoke of legends born from loss. Out there, a giant drifter rode beneath a sky that belonged to no one, his shadow stretching long across the earth. Some men, she thought, ride for gold. Others ride for justice. But once in a lifetime, one rides for redemption and leaves the desert whispering his name. Caleb Boone did not look back. The wind caught his coat, fanning it behind him like the wings of a dark angel. His hat brim dipped low, hiding the faint scar on his cheek and the tears that had no place in the life he chose. Ahead, the land opened wide, clean and wild, its silence no longer heavy but whole. As the last light of dawn touched the horizon, the man and his horse became part of it, two shadows swallowed by sun and sky. Somewhere behind him, the woman he'd saved would carry his story, and perhaps, in that telling, the ghosts he bore would finally rest. The desert wind rose one final time, gentle as breath, sweeping across the canyon, brushing over the fresh graves, the campfire ashes, and the place where a war hero found his peace. Then it drifted eastward after him, carrying his name through the sage and sand, a name that would linger long after his tracks were gone. And far ahead, where the world turned gold, Caleb Boone rode into the dawn,